Thank you, and good morning. It's good to be back here in Korea. I just want to say congratulations again to the Korean government for moving ahead with the emissions trading scheme. I come from Australia, and unfortunately we have the honour now of being the only country that had an emissions trading scheme and got rid of it. Not something that I have to say I'm too proud of, but just a couple of remarks before I go into my presentation on the Australian experience to answer some of the questions that came up, and I'm happy to discuss this during the lunch break. But Australia and Korea are actually very similar in terms of the size of population, our economies, and if you look at what the emissions trading scheme that Australia did have, very similar to what Korea has put in place. So a lot of the early experiences that we had in Australia over the first 2 years of the scheme, I think, are quite insightful for Korea. One of the key lessons for Australia was the experience of having had 4 years of reporting under a mandatory reporting scheme, similar to the Korean target management system. Liquidity probably never was fully tested because we had a fixed price during the first 3 years of the scheme, and so we would have actually only just moved to a floating price this year had the scheme not been abolished. But in terms of number of participants, very similar to the Korean scheme, about 500 corporates, and that covered probably a little more than 66% of similar to, in terms of Korea's emissions, it was probably a little higher. A combination of grandfathering, but probably a higher level of auctioning compared to Europe in the early years. But one of the big challenges for Australia and a lot of the political debate was around international competitiveness, and that really came down to dealing with our trade-exposed industries in particular, and so a lot of the focus was giving a combination of free allocation and exemption from full liability for the first 6 years of the scheme. I guess the main point I want to make, though, on the Australian scheme is that even though it has now gone, it will come back. So I've worked in the area of climate change law for over 15 years on transactions and for clients all around the world, including in Australia, and I have no doubt that within the next couple of years Australia will have an emissions trading scheme. It won't look and feel, it won't be called what it was a couple of years ago, but certainly the issue is not off the table in Australia. So certainly you shouldn't feel that Korea is too far ahead in this region, and certainly Australia will be enacting a scheme again in the next couple of years. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, I guess, really quite practical, a step plan, if you like, for how to develop internal carbon strategies. And I guess some observations in that around the experience in other markets, including in Australia. So the first point to make, which is perhaps a little self-evident, is that setting up measurement and management strategies within your corporation and at a facility level is critical under a cap and trade scheme. And I guess it's important to remember that that's critical for two reasons. At the first level, you need to meet a legal obligation, and non-compliance with that has its own implications in terms of a monetary penalty or other sanctions under Korean law. And as you know, you have a reporting and surrendering timeline under the Korean scheme to comply with. But the other important point, and this picks up on Eric's point, is that it's not just about viewing it purely as legal compliance, because if you do that, you won't necessarily end up with the most efficient outcome. And so you need to look at what's the cheapest way, the most efficient way that your organisation can meet your targets and manage the risk. So legal compliance is obviously an absolute requirement, but it's very important to look at how you meet that obligation in the most cost-effective way. So where do the costs come from? What are the costs that you have to manage within the context of the Korean emissions trading scheme? So on the one hand, I guess we talk about direct costs or indirect costs. Direct costs primarily covers, of course, your costs of buying permits, depending on how many you may have been allocated, or buying offsets. That's really, I guess, in many respects where a lot of the main costs comes from. But of course, the other cost comes from where you might decide to reduce abatement internally because that's lower than the market price. The two other there that I mentioned, developing sort of MRV systems, engaging experts, I guess are indirect in the sense that they're not costs that you pay directly into the market or to the government, but certainly they relate to the direct costs of compliance. But the other costs I want to talk about, and I'll come back to this later on, are indirect costs. And we're talking here about the costs of carbon that's passed through the economy. So depending on where you might sit in your industry, whether you've got a lot of upstream customers who themselves have liability, or indeed a lot of your downstream customers to whom you will be wishing to pass on some, if not all, of the cost of carbon. I'll come back to this, but this became, in the Australian context, a very big issue because many of the liable entities realised that the long-term contracts that they had in place, in many cases, didn't allow for the pass-through of carbon. And if you are stuck with that cost of carbon, you can't pass that on to your downstream customer, then of course that has a much bigger impact on the overall cost of compliance. So on the left there, I've just sort of picked out a few of the sort of high-level legal obligations under the Korean Emissions Trading Scheme. Non-compliance with those timelines in terms of reporting information, as well as, of course, surrender dates, will have a legal sanction under the law. And what I've highlighted on the right are really some of the key data monitoring and reporting responses that you need to take into account. So what we found in the Australian experience, and I think it was similar in the US, in the European Emissions Trading Scheme. In Europe, of course, as Eric said, they had 2 years of trial and error within the pilot scheme. In the Australian context, Australian companies had 4 years of mandatory reporting before the carbon price was introduced. But certainly a lot of the experience in those early years was making sure that data collection systems were put in place early on, that they were up to date and continuous in the sense that at any point in time they'd be up to date in terms of data. And of course you need to make sure that your own data collection protocols are going to be at least of an equivalent standard to what's required under the Korean Emissions Trading Scheme, and you may look to international standards that are above that to benchmark against. And I think, as we'll hear from Charlotte after me, there's obviously a big focus on internal governance. So getting buy-in from all the relevant positions within the corporation that are important to feed that data through, whether that be in terms of different lines of reporting. But I guess the other point to make there is that you need to make sure that those reporting lines are fed into meet the deadlines in an integrated internal reporting cycle. So what I just want to talk you through are four sort of steps, if you like, to putting in place and implementing carbon accounting and management system. And of course, I'm just a lawyer, so I'm not a technician when it comes to a lot of the technical level issues that come up around data. But certainly, as Eric said, it is important and very useful to make use of experts and consultants who know a lot about the level of accuracy and detail that you need to be reporting to when it comes to actual data collected. So I guess the first point there to make is to really conduct a gap analysis. So obviously you through this process and many others, I'm sure, are fully understanding the new regulatory regime that is the Korean Emissions Trading Scheme. And part of that process is to look internally then at how your corporation is geared to meet those obligations. So that really requires you looking at the effectiveness of your existing systems to capture and manage carbon impacts, the different roles that need to be given responsibility for compliance with those reporting and management systems, the adequacy of existing record keeping, adequacy of training and skills, and processes for auditing emission reports. So all of this is going to be continuous and constantly improving. It's not just a one-off. But I think the other key point to make there is that you need to make sure that that carbon management plan aligns with other business systems. So you don't want to create something that sits totally outside of the normal process that you would have in place for reporting on other compliance requirements, whether that be environmental or other areas of law that govern your operations. The next point there is, the next step then is to, on the basis of conducting that gap analysis, so you know where you might have deficiencies or good systems that you can already work on, is implementing a robust monitoring, reporting and verification system. And so I guess the first question there to ask is, does your company have confidence in the integrity of its emissions data as calculated for the purposes of the Korean Emissions Trading Scheme? Now, just as an example, in Australia, the National Audit Office, which carried out audits on reports provided by Australian companies under the Australian scheme, there were 72% contained errors. That's quite high, but I guess the key thing is that 17% of reports contain significant errors. And that's really important because, of course, an error, if you under-report, then you've got a potential liability to make good, and that may have its own additional costs. But if you over-report, then of course you may be unnecessarily paying for compliance or meeting those obligations which you don't need to. So as I said, your business should undertake a review of emissions data and reports in order to determine whether you could pass a reasonable assurance audit. So these reviews require, as outlined there, understanding data capture systems and processes at both the corporate and site level, checking for accuracy, reviewing the effectiveness of internal assurance measures, and going through calculations to ensure that all are accurate. So in the Australian experience, and I think this might have been similar in Europe, even though mandatory auditing or third-party auditing wasn't a requirement for all reports, certainly in the early years of the emissions trading scheme, most, if not all, liable entities got third-party auditors in to test the information. Particularly because once you move from just mandatory reporting to an actual liability, which had a carbon exposure, then corporates wanted to make sure that from the beginning, the data that was being used, the systems they had, were going to stand up under the scheme. So I think certainly, I think in the Korean context, you have mandatory third-party auditing, if I'm correct. So you'll be doing that at any rate. Now this third step really picks up on a lot of the lessons that Eric talked about in terms of that question of whether you are a seller or a buyer in the market. And as Eric said, I mean, in the early stages, it's going to be hard to fully know what the market price is until trades start occurring. But certainly the next step, once you've set up your reporting system, you've got confidence that it's going to meet the legal requirements and give you a good understanding of what your emissions position is. You need to then look at how do you meet your projected liability this year and the next. And I guess the key objective there is to determine the cost of your internal abatement versus market price for buying permits and offsets. And as Eric noted, that's well, it's often not easy to determine that cost. If you've got a number of facilities across a corporate, how do you, there'll be different costs of abatement for each of those facilities. But that's really a critical step, is to work out what you see as your cost of internal abatement, because that really dictates then whether you need to go into the market to buy, or whether indeed you're in a position to sell because you've freed up permits. Now, the next point there also touches on something that Eric mentioned, which is that the question of then, do you look at your compliance just at a facility level, or do you look at it at a corporate level? In the Australian scheme, there were actual mechanisms built in, and this may be something that that might be a lesson that could be looked at in the Korean scheme over time. But under the Australian scheme, you could formally transfer liability within a corporate group. So you could shift the liability around to an entity within a group which you believed had the better position to manage that liability. And in effect, as Eric was saying, you can create your own trading bubble, as it were, around your own facilities by looking at their liability at a corporate level. And as Eric said, making sure that you don't end up having one facility buying from another within the market, but using those unders and overs within your corporate group to manage that liability at least cost. So key carbon cost management issues here include forecasting prices and future liabilities for permits and offsets. You obviously need to work out not just what your emissions are this year from a retrospective reporting basis, but actually projecting what you think your emissions are going to be over the coming years. The actual purchasing of permits and credits and banking permits and the decisions around the different mix of those arrangements. And then the fourth step I would want to touch on is really, as I talked about earlier on, managing carbon costs pass-through. So the first step really is then to also think about in determining your overall, the best way to comply and minimise your costs. How much of that can you pass through to downstream customers? So the aim, of course, of emissions trading scheme, as the ministry mentioned, is to reduce emissions, and you reduce emissions by putting a price in the economy. Ultimately, end consumers will pay for that, but if that price increase is too high for many consumers, those goods may be less competitive than competitors who have been able to reduce their emissions. So if you can pass through, that doesn't necessarily mean you always will, because it goes to competitiveness of your product. But certainly in the Australian experience, we saw, whether it be power sectors or large industrial users, a lot of pass-through of full costs down to the next downstream customer, which might have been a wholesale customer, not necessarily a retail customer. But of course, the ability to do that will depend on the status of your commercial relationship with those customers, and in particular, the existing contracts that you have in place. And certainly if you look at many sectors, trading in energy and otherwise, you often have fairly long-term contracts in place. So you may have particular provisions of those contracts which don't allow the pass-through. As a general observation from a lot of the contracts that we looked at, it's fair to say that most of them did not anticipate a carbon price in a way that made it easy to determine that price could be passed through. There was a lot of ambiguity in those contracts, and that's because they had not fully anticipated what an emissions trading scheme might look like. And I suspect that's probably similar in the Korean context. So in the early days of the Australian scheme, there were a lot of renegotiation of existing contracts to work out how that price was going to be passed through down to customers. This diagram just shows you what some of those costs are. Obviously, you've got an upstream supplier, their own carbon permit costs, the costs of internal reductions, their costs of data collection, emissions reporting, indirect costs as well, increased energy costs that are being passed downstream, and other compliance costs. So as a company, it's looking at where you can resist some of those costs being passed through to you, or where you have to accept them under contract, how you can then pass those on downstream to your customers. So just to conclude, I guess there's sort of a few key steps in summary. The first one, as I mentioned, was understanding the key legal and compliance issues So the coverage, emissions liability, reporting standards, audits, deadlines, penalties. Ensure that you've got robust MRV systems that address all these liabilities and deadlines under the scheme. Develop your internal compliance resources to meet those requirements and deadlines. Another lesson really, both in Europe and Australia, was building that relationship with the key regulators. Particularly in the early years, as Eric said, there'll be a lot of experiences that the scheme might not have been designed in a way which anticipated certain outcomes, and that having that dialogue with the regulators is important in order to understand whether changes might need to be made, or just understanding how the scheme is going to be implemented from a regulator's point of view. It's also important to be proactive in developing a corporate carbon market strategy. I think Startcraft is a good example of looking at how you take what is a liability and turn that into potentially an opportunity. And then finally, you need to constantly assess and evaluate the MRV and compliance strategies to make sure they adapt to the ongoing development. Certainly, all schemes will add things to them. They might change things, even though at the moment you know exactly what you think it's going to look like for the next 5 years. The experience has been in other markets that you tend to have changes to these schemes along the way, hopefully done in such a way that don't unfairly burden the market, that have taken positions on the expectation of what the scheme is, but certainly you do need to build in flexibility to adapt to those changes going forward. So I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.